Thank you very much, Andy. All right, well, thank you all for attending. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I hope you'll find this interesting. First, a few words about myself. I got my career started back in the 80s at Los Alamos. It's a picture of Los Alamos National Laboratories. And so that was a lot of fun, worked on crays and connection machines and computers like that, which of course, the cell phone you carry around in your pocket is a lot more powerful than those machines were. My claim to fame is I did 17 years at Microsoft. I was Bill Gates' technology advisor for 3.5 years. I ran the Microsoft's advertising division, and I was CTO for Microsoft Online. And after that, I did, as part of the management team at AOL, part of the turnaround team, when it spun out again and went as a public company. So as CTO, I ran about a third of the company. And these days, I'm working on cybersecurity with my new company, Polyverse. And so we're working in this field of moving target defense as well. So when you think about cybersecurity, I want to walk you through a story here of Sun Tzu, Einstein, to be named gentlemen, and zombies. And they all relate, if you can believe that. And so hopefully I will, by the end of this talk, I will have you convinced that all these four people, they all tie together in a very coherent way. So let's start with Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu, if you're not familiar with him, very, very famous, basically military tactician from China from hundreds of years ago. And he wrote a very famous book called The Art of War. And there's a lot of wisdom in the art of war. And one of the chief things that he advocated is don't do full-on frontal attacks. Find out where your enemy is weak, strike there, and instead of striking where your enemy is strong. So try to basically practice asymmetric warfare. And that's sort of a very fundamental concept, and this has been around with human history now for thousands of years. So when you think about this idea of asymmetric warfare and you apply it to computers, are we weak anywhere? I mean, it's pretty much every week now you see that somebody getting hacked, right? Capital One, Anthem Blue Cross, Primera Blue Cross, Sony, Home Depot, Target, Office of Personnel Management, Democratic National Committee. I mean, these things go on and on and on and on and on. I'm not going to bore you with all the details. You can read easily in the papers, just the stats. But you got to kind of look at it and say, what the heck is going on? Well, for the uninitiated, what's going on is people are making a lot of money doing this. The sophistication of sort of the whole cyber attack world, it's completely gone in a horizontal marketplace, if you're familiar with that from Clayton Christensen. There are literally specialist companies that do nothing but create attacks or find bugs and create exploits. There's other companies that do nothing but just take over computers and then they'll resell them on the black market, or they'll take over passwords and try to find passwords and resell those. And so it's gotten very, very specialized, and there are a lot of different players in this space. Some of the stuff you hear a lot about these days in the news, of course, is Russia and China for sort of that nation-state level attacks. But then going down from the nation-states, the China, Russia, Iran, and so forth, you have essentially organized crime, right? Because if you can steal a credit card number, you can steal medical information, you can steal somebody's personal identity and go steal their tax refund, for example, you can make money doing this. And then sort of stepping down from there, you basically have your terrorists who are doing it just to cause trouble, and then you've got your what are commonly referred to as script kiddies, basically the folks who are doing this for sort of fame and glory on their own, but they don't really have a big agenda. But one of the things that's really interesting is just how pervasive the tools can become. So maybe just a quick show of hands. Anybody in here own a tank? Okay. There's one. Was that?
He used to have people in this group.
Oh, he used to. Well, like Schwarzenegger's got one, so.
I actually know an engineer who has it.
Okay. Do you own a nuclear weapon?
I don't, and he doesn't as far as.
Okay. So for anybody on the video, since you can't see the lack of hands, nobody in here has a tank or a nuclear weapon. Because in sort of traditional, arms control, the weapons that are used by countries, tanks and jet airplanes and aircraft carriers and nuclear missiles, those are basically controlled. You just can't go and buy an aircraft carrier or a tank as a private citizen. Certainly not one that's, functioning. But in computers, well, what's a nation-state, military-grade, virus or malware? Just some code. And if you look at attacks like WannaCry, for those of you that aren't familiar, WannaCry was an attack that hit Windows, attacked the file system, basically bricked, couple million Windows computers. It was quite a bad attack. Gave a lot of trouble to Maersk, the shipping line. If you look at that particular virus, it basically had two parts to it. I personally had a chance to study the code. One part of it was bluntly written by a kid. It was sloppy. The whole ransomware part was sloppy. The part that actually was the exploit that got into the Windows computer, that was genius level code. Let me ignore the ethics of it, but whoever wrote that was really, really smart. It was extremely well commented in perfect English. I'm going to let that stand for what it is, but somebody was a professional wrote that. That was written by a nation state, and yet it finds its way into the hands of a quote 15-year-old and caused a lot of trouble. Because we're basically in this world today where it is cheaper to attack than it is to defend. Right? Because I can get my hands on the cyber equivalent of tanks and aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons, just as an individual or as a terrorist organization or as part of an organized criminal gang or what have you. I can get the same tools that nations are using because it's just software. So if we want to dig into why that is, go to our second person in our lineup, Alan Turing. Very famous British computer scientist, one of the very first, and he formulated something called the halting problem. And since I know there are a number of computer science folks in the audience here, I'm going to skip the math and I'm going to abuse the actual formulation of the halting problem and go with a more practical definition, which is basically that all software is going to have bugs. If you have any non-trivial piece of software, there's no way to prove that it is unhackable, at least with our current understanding and current technology. And so if all software has bugs, that gives an attacker something to exploit. And if you look at this sort of prevalence of bugs, there's actually a lot of bugs out there. This is something my company puts out, but it's completely open source. It's something called the Open Linux Weakness Report. And what we've done is taken a static code analyzer. This is essentially spell check for code. So what we've done is taken static code analyzers. These are essentially spell checkers for software. They find bugs. And in my company, we have over 8.8 billion lines of Linux and open source code that we apply our defense technologies to. So we simply ran these analytics tools over 8 billion lines of code. And not surprisingly, we literally find millions of unpatched bugs. Millions of bugs. This is not too shocking because you have a lot of, Linux is written in C and C++, Microsoft Windows is written in C and C++, and a lot of those bugs are pointer bugs, memory type bugs, because you have the C programming language. And what's fascinating is even with Linux, even you have version, say 2 years ago might have 1 million bugs. The version the next year sometimes has more and sometimes has less. So it's sort of like every time you fix a bug, you put another one in. And it's sort of this never-ending, whack-a-mole game of trying to fix bugs in Linux. Now, the Linux data we have, because it's open source and we're able to share that, but I can assure you that the proprietary operating systems have just as many issues. I used to be an engineer on Windows, and Windows is not magically immune from pointer bugs either, right? So this is just a fundamental problem. The software that we're using and depending on these days just has lots and lots of bugs. And can we possibly patch them fast enough, right? There's just sort of no way. And you think about sort of our current, mentality, if you will, to cyber defense. It's really one of, oh, get those patches out, right? And pretty much Apple, Microsoft, the Linux community, everybody does it. They say, oh, there's an emergency security patch, you better go do it. And yes, you should, because now the attackers know about the bug too. But nobody can patch fast enough. We're very much in a paradigm today of having a reactive approach to cybersecurity. It's patch more, do even fancier machine learning on the analytics to figure out that somebody hacked you. And fundamentally, you sort of have to ask the question, is that really working for us? I don't want to pick on any particular company, but if you look at Equifax, that was a pretty bad hack, a couple 100 million records lost. FireEye, the cybersecurity company, they had a case study of how awesome their cybersecurity was at Equifax. Now that's been taken down off the web, by the way. You can't find it anymore. You've got to go to the Internet Archive or the Wayback Machine to get it. But they had a case study of how good it was. And look, FireEye is a perfectly good firewall product. I bought it at AOL. No secret there. And for what it does a good job. But what it doesn't do is stop attackers. And it doesn't stop any serious attacker. And so we're kind of in this world today of sort of applying the same reactive philosophy over and over and over again and expecting it to change. And my claim is it's not going to change. And this is where the zombies come in. So the fundamental issue is basically the combination of zombies and Alan Turing. So everything has bugs. And so now the question is, what is the payoff for exploiting a bug? Well, in today's world, software is a monoculture. If I learn how to hack Windows, I can take over 1 billion computers. If I learn how to hack Linux, I can take over 5 billion or more computers. 10 billion if you include all the devices out there. That's pretty compelling. Doesn't really bother me if I've got to spend a lot of time learning how to hack something, or spend a lot of effort, or really poke at it, or do these really exotic, memory-based attacks where I'm worried about little gadgets and things like that. I want to explain those shortly. Who cares? Because I get 1 billion computers, right? Huge payoff. So if we want to fundamentally solve this problem, well, we know mathematically we can't fix the bugs. So we can't solve the root cause that there's bugs, but can we solve the economic root cause, which is the payoff on an attack? And that's the fundamental thesis behind an idea called moving target defense. This is an academic idea that's been around for about 30 years or so. I think is the earliest paper I recall reading about it. And it's just now coming to the forefront of being widely adopted. And the fundamental thesis of moving target defense is about changing the economics on the payoff, right? It doesn't say we can fix all the bugs. It says, what if we made it really, really hard to exploit the bugs? And if you have a bug, we've got to exploit it individually every time. So instead of a run once, break everywhere type world, it becomes a run once, break once type world. And so it's about creating dynamism and diversity in the environment. Now this isn't a terribly shocking idea. If I look around the room here, I see a lot of different folks. Right? Imagine if every human had the same DNA. Right? If we all had the same DNAs, if we are clones of each other, as a species, we would have been wiped out ages ago, right? Spanish flu, bubonic plague, zombie apocalypse. I told you zombies would come in here somewhere. Because we just would, right? This first time something went wrong, we'd all be affected by it. So our genetic diversity gives us strength and resilience as a species. And so what if we applied that same idea of diversity to software? Instead of every copy of Windows being the same, what if we could make every last one of them unique? Again, that's the idea of moving target defense. And it applies sort of top to bottom across the stack. You have moving target defense ideas in the infrastructure layer, like at your networking layer. This whole idea of polymorphic networks, where the actual configuration of the network is constantly changing, the IP addresses where things reside is constantly changing. So if you're just trying to find and discover a service that is maybe storing the credit card data, that can be very, very hard to do if the entire network topology is constantly changing. You can do the same idea to the binaries on the computers themselves, from the kernel to your middleware to the applications. You can actually make the software on the system at that binary level completely dynamic and have literally the ones and zeros, the binaries, continuously changing to go defeat any kind of memory-based attack. You can do the same thing with all going one level up the stack. You can do the same thing with all of your script engines, whether it's like a SQL Server or PHP or JavaScript or something. You can literally create dynamically create unique scripting languages such that a traditional script injection type attack won't work. And at the highest level, you have things like for authentication, you have things like multifactor authentication, right? You don't necessarily think of it, it's now a very, very commonplace. You don't necessarily think of it as a moving target defense, but you can literally go to the dark web these days and buy databases of billions of passwords, and it's super cheap. And if your password is in that database, it's game over, because it's very, very easy for an attacker to go to that database and use that password. So if you think about a password as a static defense, it's one secret, and once it's out, you're over. And instead, the multi-factor authentication is a constantly changing secret, right? It's one number used once. Now, of course, there are ways to hack sort of the current cell phone-based multi-factor authentication systems. So I'm not trying to claim that this is the panacea for all authentication type attacks. But if you think about it from the point of view of changing the economics, you go from a world in which I can take over anybody that has one of a billion passwords in literally a second, and that's super easy, to one where the only way, I shouldn't say the only way, but the common way for me to break multi-factor authentication is to have a person go phone up Verizon, fake up that person, fake out my target and say, oh, I'm doing a cell phone transfer and so forth, and get the number moved over. That's expensive, right? That's not being done in seconds across a billion different accounts. And so again, it's all about changing the economics. So if we look at it from the point of view of the software itself, one of the fascinating things is that if you look at the attacks, and IBM's Ponemon Institute did the study, 77% of all of the successful attacks last year were so-called fileless attacks, these memory-based attacks. And it spans the range. It was the Office of Personnel Management hack, which basically anybody that had anything to do with the government, you know about this one because you had your records stolen. It was the WannaCry attack. It was the Democratic National Committee email server attack. It was Equifax. All these attacks were these so-called memory-based fileless attacks. And they have a very common property to them. And the sort of common theme is that the attacks use the victim as the virus. So in the old days, call it 90s, if you wanted to write a virus, it was really easy. You just wrote evil.exe, you put it on a floppy disk, and trick somebody into installing it, and you could take over and own any DOS box. It was pretty straightforward. right? Or you could just telnet into port 25 on the email server and send any email from anybody to anybody. So no, good old days, super, super easy to write a virus or do a cyber attack. These days you can't do evil.exe. You know, the FireEyes and Palo Altos and Nortons of the world do a great job of getting rid of the sort of the really simple stuff. So what the attackers have resorted to, because again the economics favor it, is using the victim as the virus. And the way they do that is literally using the code that's there to misbehave. It's kind of like mind control. So if you take Equifax, for example, that was a script injection attack where they just literally went in and knocked over the web server. But think about that web server. That web server is supposed to be there, so it already is permissioned and signed and has all the certs and everything else. That web server already had permissions to talk to the database. It knew where the database was. It had the IP address. It had the right login. It knew how to decrypt the data from the database. And it also had permission to send data out because that's its job, to send data out to the customers. So if I can take over that web server and I want to steal all the information out of that database, easy peasy. It's got all the right building blocks for me. And so what I need to do then is basically trick that web server into misbehaving and giving me control. And that is terribly, terribly hard for traditional cybersecurity techniques, like signature scanners and firewalls to detect, because what are you going to do? Delete the web server? You can't, right? There's nothing to delete. It's literally misbehaving, right in the guts of the code. So the way that you can solve this and address it is by changing around all those guts. And so there are polymorphic operating systems now available for Windows and Linux and so forth. These are becoming fairly popular. I think all told there's maybe 10 million or more servers that are now polymorphic out there, and it's growing incredibly fast. So it's not as widely adopted yet as multi-factor authentication on phones. But the idea is very, very simple. You literally take the entire stack of the operating system, from the kernel to all your drivers to your libraries like libc to your middleware pieces like a web server, what have you, and you literally make them unique at the binary level on each and every server. And if you make them unique, then what you're able to do is foil the attacks. And let me explain how that works. All right, if I go off, is it still working? Yes. This one I do need to walk for. So this is the Spectre attack. Everybody familiar with Spectre, or is that? Spectre was a class of cyber attacks found by Google that basically affect Intel and AMD chips. And it basically used a flaw in the chip to let somebody take over the kernel and get full control of a computer, so in a very simple sense. And the way that it works is in the victim and the attacker, I am able to know exactly the set of instruction sequences that I'm going to see. And so in the Spectre's case, what it does is it tricks the instruction prefetch pipeline of the chip. And as the attacker, what I want to do is, okay, I know my victim for controlling access or getting the credit card or whatever piece I want to get to. I know exactly where that code is. I can inspect it, and I'm going to get the exact sequence of assembly instructions. And I'm going to write my own program that has that exact same sequence of instructions. And I'm going to trick the instruction pipeline of the chip to start executing kernel code of my own design, because I've now told it to go prefetch all of these instructions. And so it ends up being a very, very effective technique to break out of user mode into the kernel. And again, it works only because I know exactly what to expect. If you go to a polymorphic operating system, when you change around all those binaries, you're using different registers, different sequence of instructions, and it's different on every computer, every server. And some of the more advanced installations, it literally changes every system call. So if your binaries are constantly changing, the attacker doesn't really know what's there. And if they don't know what's there, it becomes very, very costly for them to figure out to sort of reuse those existing components. And they'll have to resort to different means to attack. And so that's what a polymorphic operating system will do. I guess I'm going to do questions at the end, but if anybody has questions, feel free to ask in the middle. It's always a lot more fun that way. Makes sense so far on kind of that binary diversification? So if you go up the stack to the script engines, if you think about the classic script injection attack, it would be, say, SQL injection attack. Up in Seattle, where I live, they've now, over the last decade, they've introduced toll roads across the bridge and a few other places. And these toll roads work on a camera, so they'll take your camera and scan your license plate. I have not done this, but I am sorely tempted to go get one of those custom license plates and have it be semicolon drop table. So by the laughter, I think most people know exactly what's going to happen at that point. Now, look, I haven't done that. Turns out it's one character too many versus Washington state law, so I'd have to think of a different injection attack. But that's the classic thing, is that, you know, if there is a bug in somebody's handling of SQL queries, and they don't do the sort of user supply data concatenation with the SQL commands correctly, then if your last name becomes drop table or something like that, you can end up causing a lot of havoc to the database. But that only works if you know what the SQL language is. Drop means something in SQL. From means something. Where means something. Table means something. Well, what if it wasn't drop anymore? What if it was drop 1, 2, 3? Or XYZ 4, 5, 6 was really the drop command. Right? What if we actually just dynamically changed the programming language of these different script engines? And so I have an example here of PHP where, you know, it's done exactly like this. And the PHP polyscripting is fully open source. But it literally changes not only the keywords of the language, but also the grammar. I just have keywords up on the slide because that's the easiest to get. And if you continuously change these things, then it becomes very, very hard for somebody to do a mass attack. There was a really bad, probably the worst script injection attack I'm familiar with is one called Drupalgeddon. I think it was about 2 years ago. It might be 3 years ago now. But it was attacking a bug in the PHP bug in the Drupal content management system. It literally took down about a third of the world's websites within hours. If you didn't get your patch up within 8 hours, your website was taken over. It was a very, very nasty script injection bug. And the reason those work is because I could write my own nasty PHP code, and it was going to work on tens of millions of websites. But imagine if I had to write a unique, I had to go discover and do some, go break into somebody's lab and go learn exactly what flavor of PHP they were doing. And I had to do that 10 million times. There never would have been a Drupalgeddon. And that's the whole thesis behind polyscripting. Again, it's all about changing the economics of the attacks. And so if I sort of take this moving target defense idea and pop it up a level, there's an overall movement these days in sort of the leading edge cybersecurity circles called Agile Security. And the whole idea is to take the dynamism and diversity of moving target defense as a sort of a fundamental philosophy, and then just sort of ask the question, well, what else do we need to have a completely thorough and robust cybersecurity, cybersecurity program. And so the diversity and dynamism we spoke about a lot. Another very simple idea that is surprisingly not done often is minimalism. So if you think about, anybody run Microsoft Windows in the cloud by any chance? Sure, like just with Azure, just use Windows Server. Windows Server is about 20 gigabytes. It includes support for floppy disks. You can play Fortnite on it. When's the last time anybody stuck a floppy disk into a cloud server? Like never. But that code is there, and it just becomes yet another attack point. Right? We talked about WannaCry earlier. That attacked the SMB file system. Nobody's used the SMB file system in ages. This is like the 1980s, early 90s file system for network sharing in Windows. It's still there. And because it's there and was, basically it was a source of attack. And so what a lot of folks, who are kind of on the leading edge are doing these days is saying, you know what? If I'm going to be running something, let me run the exact minimal thing I need to do. And so there's a version of Linux called Alpine Linux. There's a bunch of other ones, Tiny Core and so forth, Ubuntu Core and whatnot. But Alpine is kind of the sort of popular one used by Docker. It's a 20 megabyte version. So it's a 20 megabyte web server, not a 20 gigabyte web host. And it does not include support for floppy disks and things like that. You can add it if you really need it, but by default, it's a teeny tiny operating system. So that whole idea of minimalism is just reduce your surface area, have less things to attack. Because like we've talked about before, there will be bugs, right? And I'd rather have 20 megabytes of bugs versus 20 gigabytes of bugs. It's just sort of simple math. Repeatable is another idea of this idea of what's sort of the most common source of errors in any of our systems today. Yeah, people. The whole meat space thing is just problematic. But people make a lot of mistakes. And if you can automate your processes and make them a lot more repeatable and predictable, you can get rid of a lot of sources of human error. I mentioned in the beginning of my background was, part of my background was being CTO for Microsoft Online. So I did that in the early era of Microsoft getting into online services in a big way. Obviously now, cloud and all that is kind of the big thing for Microsoft. But back in the day, it wasn't, and we sort of applied traditional Windows engineering methodologies to running online services. And so our update process could sometimes take us over a month just to update all of our servers. And needless to say, it was very, very manual. We'd commandeer a conference room and put little Post-its of like all the different steps different people were supposed to do. This operator had to go upgrade this particular machine at this particular sequence. And I mean, we got it done, but yeah, we made a lot of mistakes all the time, and it took a while to get the whole thing ironed out. And these days, it's pretty common for any of the major online cloud services to be shipping and updating many times a day. So we've gone from what used to take a month to literally minutes now. Validation is this idea of just checking your stuff. I spoke about the static code analyzers. Maybe by show of hands, anybody still writing code these days or running a team that's writing code? Do you all use a static code analyzer of any kind? Okay, I have one yes and one no. Project does? Okay, good. Just sort of think about it, like you wouldn't dream of writing an email to your boss without running it through a spell checker, right? Yet, how many organizations out there run static code analyzers? I mean, it's spell check. If you actually look at the static code analyzer market, SEML and Fortify and those, yes, sir?
That's unless your boss knows you and your misspellings, then he trusts you even
Yes, that's that actually gets to a concept called polymorphic email, which I don't have a slide on. Yeah. The comment from the no, it's great. The comment was if your boss knows that you frequently misspell, then maybe the spellings are useful because it becomes a signature for yourself. But outside of that, maybe when you go interview, you're not gonna do the misspellings. Yes, sir. Exactly, they're completely built in, but for programmers, they're not built in. Not yet, anyway. Microsoft just bought Semel, which is one of the better static code analyzers, so perhaps they're going to integrate it into Visual Studio. Yes, sir.
Programming in Rust, and it's sort of built in.
Great. Yeah. But anyway, but the whole point of validation is not that these tools are perfect, but like if you have them, use them. If you don't have them, they're probably available and get them because why not? They're relatively inexpensive. And they're easy to use, and they will catch mistakes. Encryption is another, hopefully, fairly obvious point. Have folks heard of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook? This might be commenting on this in Silicon Valley, but was that a hack? So for those that don't know, Cambridge Analytica is the current controversy around a particular company called Cambridge Analytica misusing people's data from Facebook. And sometimes in the press, you'll see it called, they hacked Facebook. No. If you put your data on Facebook, it's publicly available. And Facebook's business model, Zuck's protestations to the contrary, is to make money on your data. Now, however many transformations they do, blah, 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 fundamentally, Facebook makes money on your data, and your data is public. So if you want your data to be public, it's fine, but don't have any illusions that what you post to Facebook is somehow private. And so, encryption is just another way of saying, if you want your data to be public, put it on Facebook. If you don't want it to be public, then encrypt it and do a good job managing your keys and, basically try to keep it out of the hands of people that you don't want to have see it. And the final idea of all this is compartmentalization. Anybody heard of Ed Snowden? Yeah, so Ed Snowden is the contractor who worked for Booz Allen on behalf of the NSA, and he stole a bunch of stuff and leaked it to the press and to the Russians and basically caused a bit of brouhaha. It's kind of fascinating. I personally have the privilege of doing a lot of work with the government, and I can attest they spend a lot of effort with classification and who can know what, and doing background checks and polygraph checks and all kinds of stuff. And so you think about the NSA, they go to all this trouble and all this pomp and circumstance of like secret, top secret, and secure, compartmentalized, and special access programs and a bunch of other acronyms that you're not even allowed to talk about. And then they give this 20-something-year-old kid in Hawaii system administrator privileges. Well, not a lot of different religions in the world, but if you're in computers, the system administrator is God. I don't mean this in any kind of sacrilegious way, but they are all powerful and they control everything. And so why in the world would you go to all this trouble and all this pomp and circumstance to have all these different classification levels and then put it on a computer where basically the sysadmin has full control over everything? And that's exactly what they did. And so compartmentalization is this idea of saying, look through your processes and say, where are my single points of failure? Right? Do I have a single system administrator that could mess me up? Or do I have double checks on it? We have, just even at my own company, we have a very simple process, for example, for updating our website. No one person can update our website. It always needs at least two people for that exact same idea. It actually comes from, the idea is very, very old, but if you've ever seen the movie War Games, you think about the missile silos. There's sort of this two missile silo key, if you're familiar with that. And the keys to launch a nuclear missile are further apart than one human's hands, and two people have to do it. That's just because if one person gets corrupted, goes rogue, goes insane, you have that backup of another person. So apply the same thing to your computer systems. Find those single points of failure and put in the redundant check, whether that single point of failure is a computer failure or a human process failure. So that's pretty much all I had outside of the Q&A. The whole idea, again, is if you want to really solve the cybersecurity problem, you got to tackle it from the economic point of view, right? You got to make it too expensive to attack, whether it's having one little script that can take over 10 million websites. Let's stop that. Or just having one person that you can corrupt and steal all the data out of the NSA. Same idea, right? Look at it from the economics point of view and make it very, very expensive to attack. And if you can make it expensive for your attackers and make it more expensive for the attackers than it is for you to defend, then I think we're going to win this. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. I'd love to have any questions and discussion. Yes, sir.
So one way to reduce the viability, not the viability, but the value of an attack is to apply least privilege at very fine granularity.
Yes, sir.
So that a potential attacker gets, a successful attack gets very little.
Yes, sir.
You never mentioned that.
So the question was, one of the ways to change the economics of the attacks is basically apply fine-grained permissions and controls. And the question was, why did I not mention that? So for the purposes of a 1-hour talk, I sort of highlighted some of the more popular techniques. If you look at moving target defense broadly, MIT, a gentleman named Dr. Hamed Al-Khavri, every 4 years they publish a survey. The survey of all the different techniques is 300 pages long with no more than 1 page per technique. So there are a lot of different ideas out there. In my own personal experience, I love the idea of fine-grained control. The challenge historically has been one of complexity. You end up getting, if you try to deploy this in any kind of real environment, when you really try to get down and do all these different fine-grained controls, it ends up being very, very hard and complex to manage. If you sort of look at, kind of the example would be even firewalls, like some of the web application firewalls. They allow you, in principle, if you go look at the programming language, to have extremely fine-grained control over all the URLs and all the different parameters coming in and so forth. Yet in my personal anecdotal experience, when I go look at a customer's WAF, they usually have company.com/*, and that's the WAF rule. Because it just gets to be too much to manage.
I will agree with you because of the way people are doing it today, but it can be done in a way that is quite manageable.
I believe so, and I'm actually very hopeful for it. Speaking of MIT, they actually have a new operating system that is applying these rules literally at the data structure level. They've got some clever ideas to basically automate, what's there and what's not.
You want to look at SEL4. They're doing it right.
Okay. Thanks for the tip. The comment was, is that a company or a project?
It's an open source project out of Australia, SEL4.
SEL4 for fine-grained control, and they apparently have addressed the manageability problem. All right, thank you very much. Other comments, questions? Yes, sir.
So this whole complexity thing is interesting. Taking a look at it from another point of view, we have type 1 and type 2 error, and you cannot optimize both. You got to accept one or the other. Are you familiar with type 1 and type 2?
Briefly, but maybe elaborate a little bit so I react in the right way, because there's a lot of different error classifications.
Type 1 error is keeping somebody out who should be in, and type 2 error is keeping somebody out, letting somebody in who should be out.
Right.
So you can
Yep.
optimize for one, you can't optimize for the other. So whether it's fine-grained the more dynamic you make the system, the harder it is to manage and operate. So if you can, so there's just like a type 1, type 2 trade-off. So how, within that context, how do you decide how much? I mean, of course, you can make it more secure by making it more more in time diverse. But the more you make it that way, the more likely it is to fail because you can't operate it.
Right. So if I may summarize the question, if I have this fairly, the question is, how do you handle the trade-off between security and the complexity and manageability of deploying the security, particularly in a scenario of moving target defense where you're introducing a lot of dynamism? So this one, I'm going to get on maybe a personal soapbox. You don't. The thing that wins is simplicity. So, for example, this whole thing we're talking about, and I'll speak a little bit about what my company does. This whole thing of polymorphic operating systems. That idea has been around for 30 years. People have had the technology to do it is a scrambling compiler. I first learned of this in 2003. I was Bill Gates' technology advisor at the time. And that was the whole era of Blaster and all these things where Microsoft was, really had arguably its sort of wake-up call to worry about cybersecurity. And one of the roles that I had at that point was to just go study everything going on. And we found an academic paper called Epidemiology of Cyberattacks. And that academic paper used the mathematics of epidemiology, the spread of viruses, to basically make this argument that I made before. If things are a monoculture and everything's got a bug, we're in trouble. So this is being recorded. I'm not sure who else is going to listen, so I'm not going to give the exact wording of the conversation because it was maybe a little more colorful. But the tone of it was, between Bill Gates and I talking about this, was, all right, great, we have our answer. This is how we do it. Okay, 2003. Something like 20% of our customer base had internet access. Wasn't but a few years ago, we were still selling on floppy disks. In a world of floppy disks, how do you make everything unique? It was this problem where the mathematics and the idea was spot on, but we didn't know how to deploy it in a very practical sense. And so my view is the security technologies that are going to work and get deployed are the ones that are super easy to do. Multifactor authentication didn't take off until everybody had a cell phone. You could go buy the RSA was selling the little key fobs for, I don't remember when they introduced it, but they were selling those for a long, long time. And as a person who had a key fob, I can tell you it was a pain in the butt. Right? It just was not a very user-friendly experience. And they didn't take off that broadly, compared to just the cell phone-based multi-factor authentication. And so I think the challenge for everybody in the cybersecurity industry then is, how do we make these things really, really easy to do? In the case of the operating systems, we now have it just baked into the operating system. So it literally is one command line to install it, and it's completely fire and forget afterwards. You just change your package repository to point to a polymorphic repository, and you're done. That's it. And it took that kind of simplicity breakthrough for these things to become popular. Because if you ask somebody to do more work for security, it ain't going to happen. It's got to be built in. Yes, sir.
So that seems to address the simplicity of the user interface, but for debugging, right? It seems like if everything's moving around, that's going to be a lot harder to debug.
Yeah, it can be harder to debug, absolutely. So I would say first order of business is make it easy for the end consumer, the person actually buying, consuming the device. Otherwise, you're out of the water and won't get adopted. For pretty much for the operating system debugging, those are very easy because you end up with legitimate binaries. So it just is a regular binary that you're debugging the way you'd expect. Use GDB and everything else. For the scripting, you end up debugging with just the regular script engine, and then you apply the polymorphism second. The one that still is very hard to debug are some of the commercially available network scramblers, where you're changing the network topology. When something's not reachable, it can often be very, very hard to figure that out. And the commercial companies have some tools for those, but it is a challenge, no doubt. But, yes, sir.
It's not always that easy. Remember your slide with the switch statements and the crazy keywords? I would assume that in a case like this, the compiler would generate the same machine instructions.
Could you repeat the question? I didn't quite follow the question, sir, sorry.
You had a switch statement.
This one?
Two different versions. No,
Oh, this one.
yes. And in these two cases, I would expect the compiler to generate the same machine code if it understood what's on the right side.
Got it. So the question is, would the compiler generate the same machine code in these two cases? And let me answer in two ways. A great question, thank you, sir. So in this particular example, this was meant to be a script engine diversification idea. So in this case, the executing binary by itself would be the same, but it would be a different set of tokens going through the tokenizer and the parser and so forth, right? Because what you're trying to do in this example is stop the script injection attack. If you're to take this code, either example of it, and run it through a polymorphic compiler, you would end up with different binaries. Each compilation would be different when you run it through a polymorphic.
Same code through twice, I get
Different ones, yes, sir. And that's the whole idea of a scrambling polymorphic compiler. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder, you mentioned that you have a code analyzer or bug analyzer against the Linux and whatever other
Yes, ma'am.
system. Now, have you have any data dealing with Apple code? Because they have all this encryption going on. Does that make the less bug or more bugs?
So the
Compare with the other system.
Okay, yes, ma'am. So the question was, I showed the data for Linux bugs. Does Apple have fewer bugs because of their encryption, or
Because the encryption.
because of their encryption? So Apple is always they're a very secretive company. So let me talk more on first principles than anything specific to Apple, because I want to respect their desire for secrecy. Fundamentally, if you look at iOS, the bulk of it is C program, right? And it's basically Mac OS from Next. I mean, a couple of years hence, right? They've made it better, but it's a C program. And so oops, did I lose my mic? I think I did. All right, we'll go back to this one. So, for those of you that might know engineers at Apple, they're smart folks, right? But they're not magically smarter than any Linux engineer, and they're not magically smarter than any Microsoft engineer. No, not a million times smarter, which is what you'd need to be. And so the tools that they're using fundamentally allow for bugs. And that was kind of the whole point of Alan Turing's the halting problem, that everything's going to have bugs. And so I don't have any stats to share about the frequency of bugs in Apple products, but I do know that they know. And since I just applied my Apple patch this morning, they have bugs too, right? And so I don't think, we can't say that they are somehow magically more immune than anybody else. I think it is fair to say that Apple, as an organization, is particularly security conscious, and I think they do a better job than most. But are there viruses on Mac and iPhone? Oh yes, that there are. other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I think at one point you mentioned that there were some systems that were changing memory layouts on every system call.
Yes, sir.
Would that mess up the branch predictor or performance?
So the question is for the sort of polymorphic operating systems that are changing things, like on every system call, changing around the binaries. The question is, does that interfere with branch predictor, or if it may generalize performance in general? So for those systems, yes, they do have a performance impact. There's sort of not much getting around that. And the folks that are working on them, myself included, we basically take great pains to basically use all the spare CPU cycles, do it on secondary cores, things like that, to keep the perf impact down to a couple of %. So you can get very tricky, make the perf impact very negligible, and so if you're running like a web server or something like that, you will never notice. If you're doing anything IO intensive, you will never notice. But if you're doing a flat out spec mark, you do notice. That's part of the trade-off of doing these things dynamically. But you can get it to be very, very low overhead. But look, fundamentally, you're doing work, and work costs. So there's a limit to how fast you can make it. Yes, sir.
It's kind of a totally tangential question, but are there specific limits that you would preference for any of them? Some of us together?
All equally bad.
It depends on what you're doing. Since my engineering team loves Ubuntu, not surprisingly. We use Alpine Linux probably the most, just by sort of volume for its ultra tight, basically for that minimalism argument. And so for kind of more of the general R&D purposes, Ubuntu is kind of a really good one because they've done a great job with that distribution, and then use Alpine for production because it's skinny. Yes, sir.
So I find when a system is a push system versus a pull system, like Ubuntu is a push system, and things happen behind your back and you don't know about it. It just happens, so it works, kind of, until it breaks.
So the
Pull system, I have to download all my updates.
right.
I know which update break.
Right. So the question, or was just comment? Oh, so the comment was push versus pull systems, particularly with respect to automatic updates. And the advantage to a pull system is when you break yourself, as opposed to getting broken behind the scenes with a push system. There are pros and cons to both. I personally prefer pull, but you have to set that up in your DevOps pipeline so that at the start of every pipeline run, you pull, and then you run your tests. Yes, sir, you had a question?
Please prove me wrong, but my belief in Spectre is that if you have polymorphism each time you recompile the program, that doesn't help you. What you need is polymorphism each time you run the program.
So the question was, with Spectre, you need polymorphism. Polymorphism each time you compile doesn't help, but polymorphism every time you run would help. Is that the right way to? Yeah. So first, if I were to back up, Spectre is now a class of attacks. And fundamentally, what you need for at least all the classes I'm familiar with, although I just did hear about a new one that came out that I have not yet read the paper, so piece if I don't have it, if my taxonomy is not complete. The idea is to basically match an attacker with a victim, right? And so the real question isn't so much in that sense, the question really is, when does the compile happen, and do you end up with two different versions? And if you're ever in a situation where the attacker can disassemble your binary and then launch the Spectre attack, you've got a problem, right? Unless you're doing the fully dynamic. And that's why when I think about the sort of the market today for polymorphic technologies, the sort of the broad market of I mentioned there's about 10 million servers or more that are running polymorphic technologies of some kind. The vast majority of those are basically the compile time, just sort of one shot. Every time you update, you get a new one. And they're not doing it on the fly. The customers that are extremely concerned about security are doing it on the fly, and they're willing to pay the extra performance penalty to the gentleman's question before. And so right now, it's really a customer choice for the products that are out there in market. Maybe at some point they'll all become dynamic once people are okay with the performance penalty, but we'll see. So, back in the corner, I haven't got to you, sir.
You mentioned that the successor languages are very prone to bugs, which we all know because we talked about it before. Do you have any observations of which languages are less prone to attack?
So the question was, do we have any observations of which languages are less prone to attack? I do like Rust and CheckC out of Microsoft, particularly if you're doing system-level programming. Go is also another popular choice. None of these things are panaceas, and when you look at Rust and Go and CheckC in particular, all of them have some form of unsafe keyword that lets you escape out to go interact with the rest of the world. So, I can't announce this yet. There are was that, yeah. Right. I have no idea who's behind the camera. There's a lot of, let me say it generically, there's nothing to announce yet. I am not making an announcement, to be very clear, but there is a lot of interest in a Rust-based Linux. Let me leave it at that. But the challenge you have, it's kind of like, if folks are familiar with ASLR, that's Agile Space Layout Randomization. It's a very good technology. It actually grew out of that Bill Gates paper that I mentioned with the, about creating diversity. But for the first, it was introduced in Windows Vista, if I recall correctly. But for like the first 10 years, everybody bypassed it pretty easily because not every last DLL in a Windows program was done with ASLR. So even as recently as 4 years ago, the OLE help dialog, basically the DLL that put up the help screens for Office and things like that, was not ASLR'd. And so if you're the attacker, you just went there and got all your stuff because you knew exactly where it was. And so it was only until about Windows 10 when pretty much everything became ASLR'd. So it was almost a decade-long effort to get that technology to the point where it sort of really became effective. And I'd make the same argument for Rust and Go and CheckC from Microsoft. If anybody comes at you and says, oh, life is solved because we wrote our thing in Rust, we'll never have memory issues. Yeah, no, not really. But is it still a good idea to use one of those languages versus C if you're doing something new? Heck yeah, because eventually it's going to catch up. And that's kind of the idea behind taking critical pieces of America and frankly the world's infrastructure like Linux and re-engineering them to be in one of these languages. I guess the one thing I can say, because I think it's public, the CheckC effort out of Microsoft, one of their design points explicitly was being amenable to automatic conversion from C and C++. So Rust is a little awkward to automatically convert. CheckC is actually pretty straightforward to automatically convert. Because everybody has this idea of saying, let's take our legacy and over time move it because it's worth the effort. But we won't really see the payoff until we get to the end. With CheckC, yes sir, yeah. It's pretty clever the way they did it. Gentleman, it's called CheckC. Oh, sorry. The question was, with CheckC, could you do the automatic conversion from C and C++, even with pointer arithmetic? And the way they did it, not all. Look, if you got demented, No. And I've certainly written a lot of demented pointer arithmetic code in my past. But if you just were to take your vanilla, star P++ type construct, just incrementing a pointer, those things are pretty easy to spot in the translating compiler, and then you convert them over. So a gentleman named David Tarditi is the lead engineer on that at Microsoft. And kudos to them. I think they've done some really good work there. But again, whether it's check, C, Rust, Go, it's all about this idea of let's do something with our existing install base. Yes, sir.
How much work has been done on, setting up normal environments? Are people selling pieces of code that are sort of designed to plug in there?
So the question was how much work has been done on setting up minimal environments. I would argue in the last, say, 5 years, a lot. And Docker maybe is the shining star of all of that. And its default Linux installation is Alpine Linux, that a little 8 megabyte version of it. And so this idea of making things smaller, has really taken off in the Linux community in particular. Microsoft last year announced Windows Server Nano. Now, Windows Server Nano at their last developer preview was 1 gigabyte, so I think they kind of missed the real idea there. It's nano the way that I do my diets, but that's a whole different topic. But even Microsoft has said, oh gosh, there is something to be said for this minimalism idea, and we're going to apply it. And so they're working on it. But having been a Windows engineer in the past, even getting Windows down to a gigabyte, that actually was a very, all teasing on Microsoft aside, that actually was an impressive bit of engineering. Windows is not easy to shrink. Oh, yes, sir.
Linux distribution where, you get the CD and you boot it up and you say yes, yes. And there's a bazillion pieces of stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
How do I get rid of it all?
So the question was, when I just do a standard Linux install and get a CD or whatnot, you get everything, and that's correct. You like Ubuntu, just the standard Ubuntu, LTS, like desktop download. The desktop download of Ubuntu is 20 gigs. It's big, and so what, kind of the gentleman's question about like what Linux, are we using in my company? We end up doing both. Like for sort of the day-to-day just development, just on somebody's laptop or whatnot, they just get the big Linux because you got all your tools, all that stuff in there. Well, a lot of that stuff is actually useful for a developer, and they just get it all. Let the developer party on and have all the tools that he or she is familiar with. But then when you go to production, when you're actually running it where somebody might attack it, use the teeny tiny Linuxes there. And the thing that made that very practical these days is Docker, because I can be running Docker on my Ubuntu desktop or on my Linux virtual machine, my Ubuntu virtual machine, and I can be doing my development using a tiny. Are you familiar with what Docker is? Maybe I should. Sorry, I'm forgetting my rules here that need to explain terms since it's a broader audience. Docker is basically a super lightweight virtualization engine. So it's like VMware or something like that, but 10 times faster. And so it lets you run on a Mac or a Windows machine or another Linux machine a tiny little operating system. And so you'll basically be doing your coding on a Windows and Mac and Ubuntu, and then your execution of the code is in a lightweight Linux virtual machine, a Docker container. That's one of these super tiny little Linuxes. And then you take that container as is and move it to production. So you get the same environment from dev to staging to pre-prod to production. So that really became very practical in the last 5 years. And it's a very seamless experience these days.
I guess half the question I was trying to ask is, how do I get rid of the stuff on my laptop that I don't need? Don't force it.
That was kind of my answer was A, don't put it there if you can avoid it, but B, what kind of, are you a Ubuntu laptop or a Windows or? So for Ubuntu, it is the apt system, so you just do apt uninstall, and then you got to go list out everything you want off. It's just kind of annoying, but you can do it.
Yeah, but the list is thousands long.
Yes, sir.
Some of them are important, that I don't necessarily know, and some of them I recognize.
That's why it's easier to build up. Start with Alpine. It's 8 megabytes, and add in exactly what you need. It's just the easier way to do it. I personally have given up trying to remove stuff, and if you're trying to do it in Windows, just really doesn't work. So, and in Windows, you can't do things like remove the floppy disk support. It's sort of baked in. Yes, sir.
You try to remove things from some operating system like Windows and things break very quickly. And other things like Siglin, which I run on Windows machines because I can add just what I want.
Right. So the comment was, removing things from Windows is hard, but if you run Cygwin on Windows, you're basically getting a little Unix environment, and it's pretty easy to add exactly what you want. So Cygwin is another form of it. I personally like Docker these days better than Cygwin, just because I get a true Linux kernel, and it's completely seamless. I'm running in my same Mac command line. I'm using my Atom editor, and I'm saving things to GitHub. It's all Mac, and I've got my iTunes running and all that. So just Mac OS, but then my actual code is just Linux.
Microsoft?
No, this is my current world. A fair number of ex-Microsoft folks do end up buying a Mac for some reason.
Remember Windows was much better on the Mac.
Mac, yeah, Apple's done a great job on the hardware. If you use Boot Camp, Windows runs really well.
Bill Gates told them to tune it down.
I can neither confirm nor, yeah, let me not talk about that.
My joke.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Well, thank you all very much for a lively set of Q&A.